On the morning of the 24th of December 1951, on the balcony of the Almanar Palace in the Mediterranean port city of Benghazi, one of the most improbable acts of state creation in modern history took place. King Idris I, 62 years old, dressed not in European court regalia, but in the white robes and black and white turban of a Bedouin sheikh, read aloud in Arabic the proclamation declaring the independence of the United Kingdom of Libya. Beside him stood Adrian Pelt, a Dutch journalist serving as United Nations Commissioner who formally transferred state power on behalf of the international community. The British Union Jack was lowered from the palace flagstaff. In its place rose a new tricolour of red, black and green with a white crescent and star at its centre, designed by the Vice President of the Constituent Assembly, Omar Fayek Shenib. It was the first time in history that a sovereign state had been called into existence by a resolution of the United Nations. For the first time in 2,000 years, the three historic regions of the central North African coast, Tripolitania in the west, Cyrenaica in the east, and the vast Saharan interior of Fezzan, were united under one flag, one constitution, and one king. Libya was the first independent African state to emerge from European colonial rule after the Second World War, predating Sudan by 5 years and Ghana by 6. And the man on the balcony was simultaneously the temporal head of the new state and the spiritual head of a Sufi religious order that had been founded on a hill overlooking the Kaaba in Mecca more than a century before. It was an extraordinary destination for a religious brotherhood that had begun its life with a single Algerian theologian in voluntary exile, gathering disciples around him at the foot of Mount Abu Kubais. This is the story of the Senusi, the Sufi order that became a kingdom, the kingdom that was overthrown in 2 hours by a 27-year-old captain, and the family whose name a Libyan dictator would spend 42 years systematically erasing from the country they had founded. To understand how the Senusi arose, we have to begin with the world they emerged into. A world in which the political map of North Africa was unravelling and the Islamic spiritual map was being rewritten at the same time. By the late 1700s, the central Mediterranean coast of Africa was nominally Ottoman territory, organised into a province called the Vilayet of Tripolitania. The province was governed by a wali, an appointed governor, and divided administratively into smaller districts called sanjaks, including those of Tripoli, Benghazi, Fezzan, Khoms, and Jabal al-Gharb. But Ottoman authority over the region was, by this period, more theoretical than practical. For more than a century between 1711 and 1835, real power had rested with the Karamanli dynasty, founded when a Janissary cavalry officer of Anatolian Turkish origin named Ahmed Karamanli murdered the Ottoman governor and seized Tripoli for himself. The Karamanlis paid only nominal tribute to Istanbul and ran what was, in effect, an independent kingdom. Their economy rested on 2 pillars. The first was Mediterranean piracy. The Karamanli corsairs preyed on European shipping and extracted protection payments from any nation that wished to keep its merchant fleet safe. The second was the trans-Saharan trade in gold, ivory and enslaved people that flowed northward across the desert from sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean ports. The collision between Karamanli Tripoli and a young United States produced one of the strangest episodes in early American military history. In 1801, the Karamanli ruler Yusuf demanded an increased annual tribute from the American government, and President Thomas Jefferson refused. Yusuf declared war on the United States by chopping down the flagpole at the American consulate in Tripoli on the 10th of May. 4 years of intermittent naval combat followed, culminating in a small force of United States Marines and mercenaries marching 521 miles overland from Alexandria to capture the Libyan port of Derna in the spring of 1805. It was the first time the American flag was raised in combat on foreign soil. The episode is remembered today in the second line of the Marines' hymn, "To the shores of Tripoli." But by the 1830s, the Karamanli system had collapsed. Post-Napoleonic European treaties had ended the corsair economy. Yusuf abdicated in 1832 and his sons fell into civil war. Sultan Mahmud II seized the opportunity, and on the 27th of May, 1835, an Ottoman naval expedition landed at Tripoli, deposed the last Karamanli, and reimposed direct Istanbul rule for the first time in 124 years. Yet even this restored authority extended only as far as the coastal garrisons. In the desert interior of Cyrenaica, the eastern province centered on Benghazi, and the limestone highlands of the Jebel Akhdar, the Green Mountain, Ottoman power was nominal at best. The Bedouin tribes of the interior had never been administered by any state. While the political order of North Africa was decaying, the religious order of the Islamic world was being transformed. Across the Sunni heartlands, the spiritual life of ordinary Muslims was organized through structures called tariqas, or Sufi brotherhoods. Each tariqa was an organized mystical fellowship that transmitted a chain of spiritual initiation from a founding sheikh down through generations of teachers and students. Members of a tariqa would meet at a zawiyah, a lodge that served simultaneously as a school, a mosque, a hostel for travellers, and a centre for charitable work. The dominant school of Islamic jurisprudence in this region was the Maliki Madhab, founded in 8th century Medina, which placed particular weight on the customary practice of the Prophet's own city. In the early 1800s, this Sufi landscape was being shaken by a wave of reformist movements that called for a return to the Quran and the example of the Prophet, and a stripping away of what reformers regarded as accumulated corruptions. The most radical of these reform currents was Wahhabism, founded in Central Arabia by Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab in the 1740s in alliance with the Saud family, a movement that rejected the entire Sufi tradition as unlawful innovation, denounced the veneration of saints as idolatry, and seized Mecca and Medina between 1803 and 1805 before being crushed by an Egyptian army in 1818. It is worth flagging at the outset that the Senusi, despite their later reputation in European newspapers as fanatical desert Puritans, were the precise opposite of Wahhabis. They were Sufis. They built shrines, venerated saints, used the dhikr ceremony of rhythmic remembrance, and operated firmly within the Maliki tradition. The reform current to which the Senusi actually belonged was a quieter movement, led by a Moroccan scholar named Ahmad ibn Idris al-Fazi, who lived from 1760 to 1837, and who taught in Mecca during the same decades that the Wahhabis were being suppressed. Ibn Idris emphasized what he called the Tariqa Muhammadiyah, the Muhammadan path, meaning a direct visionary connection to the Prophet rather than an emphasis on the mediating saints of the older brotherhoods. After his death, his students would found the major reformist Sufi orders of the 19th century. The most consequential of those students was the man who concerns this story. While these religious currents were stirring, the economic geography of the Sahara was also shifting in a way that would prove decisive. Around the year 1810, a new caravan route opened that ran directly from the Sultanate of Wadai, in what is now eastern Chad, north through the Libyan oases of Kufra and Jalu and Aujila, to the Mediterranean port of Benghazi. This new route bypassed both Fezzan and Darfur and quickly became one of the most important trade arteries on the continent, with caravans of 200 to 300 camels making the journey every 2 or 3 years. The total number of enslaved people trafficked across the Sahara during the 19th century alone is estimated by historians at 1.2 million human beings, a figure that gives some sense of the scale of commerce passing through the Libyan oases. Whoever controlled the zawiyas along this route controlled the movement of goods, people, and information across an area larger than Western Europe. And then there were the Bedouin themselves. The Arab tribes of Cyrenaica traced their descent to the Banu Sulaim, who had migrated west across North Africa from the Arabian Peninsula in the 11th century. By the 19th century, they were divided into a noble layer called the Saadi tribes, who claimed descent from a legendary ancestress and held inherited rights to land and water, and a client layer called the Marabtin, who lived under the protection of the Saadi, but included a special category of holy lineages, exempt from tribute because they carried barakah, divine blessing. The British anthropologist Edward Evans Pritchard, who served as a political officer with the British military administration of Cyrenaica during the Second World War, called the resulting political system ordered anarchy. Order was maintained not by any central authority, but by a delicate genealogical balance in which segments of a tribe might feud bitterly with one another, but would unite against more distant segments. The crucial implication was that no Saadi tribe could legitimately claim authority over any other Saadi tribe. Unifying authority, if it ever came, would have to come from outside the tribal genealogy altogether, from a Sharifian holy lineage carrying barakah, capable of mediating disputes without threatening anyone's autonomy. The final element of the world that produced the Senusi was a French army. On the 5th of July, 1830, a French expeditionary force of 37,000 men, sent by the government of Charles X in retaliation for an incident in which the Dey of Algiers had struck the French consul 3 times with a fly whisk, entered the city of Algiers and ended more than 3 centuries of Ottoman Regency rule. What followed was a long and brutal colonization of Algeria, resisted from 1832 to 1847 by a Sufi trained leader named Abd al-Qadir, and accompanied by the gradual destruction of the religious infrastructure of the Western Maghreb. The conquest of Algeria did 2 things at once. It demonstrated to the entire Islamic world that European armies were now capable of dismantling Muslim states from the sea inward. And it sent waves of religious refugees and reformists eastward across North Africa, looking for ground that European powers had not yet reached. It was into this world, an Ottoman Empire whose grip was loosening, a Sufi reform movement gathering strength in Mecca, a Bedouin society waiting for unifying authority, and a French army devouring his birthplace, that Sayyid Muhammad ibn Ali al-Senusi was born in 1787. The founder of the Senusi order was born in the village of Al-Wasita, near the coastal town of Mostaganem in the western part of what is now Algeria. He was, by the standards of his time and place, an aristocrat of the spirit rather than of property. As a young man, he studied at the zawiyas around Mostaganem and Mascara, then made his way to Fez in Morocco to study at the ancient Qarawiyyan University, founded in the 9th century and one of the oldest continuously operating universities in the world. There he absorbed the Maliki legal tradition, the theological school known as Asharism, and the teachings of several major Sufi orders. In 1824, he travelled to Cairo and attended lectures at the Al-Azhar Mosque University. But his criticism of the regime of Muhammad Ali Pasha provoked a fatwa branding him heterodox, and he left for Mecca, where he arrived in the late 1820s. The name by which his family would become known is itself worth pausing over. The full Nisba, the lineage name of the founder, was Sayyid Muhammad ibn Ali ibn al-Senusi al-Khattabi al-Hassani al-Idrisi al-Mustaganimi. Each element carries a piece of his identity. The honorific Sayyid marks descent from the Prophet Muhammad. The element al-Hassani denotes descent specifically through Hassan ibn Ali, the eldest grandson of the Prophet, son of Ali, and Fatima al-Zahra. The element al-Idrisi traces that descent through Idris I, who founded the Idrisid dynasty of Morocco in the year 788, the first Sharifian state in the Maghreb and the ancestral fountain from which most of North Africa's noble lineages claim to flow. The element al-Khattabi refers to a particular branch of the Idrisid line, descending from a forebear named Khattab, and should not be confused with the second caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, to whom it has no connection. The element al-Mustaganimi simply means of Mostaganem, his birthplace, and the central element al-Sanusi, the name that would attach itself to his order and eventually to a kingdom, derives from a venerated Maliki theologian and Sufi master named Sidi Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Sanusi al-Tilimsani, who died in the year 1490 in Tlemcen in western Algeria. The founder of the order had been named after him. Within a generation, the name al-Sanusi would denote not a long-dead saint, but an entire religious brotherhood, and within a century, an entire people. In Mecca, Muhammad ibn Ali al-Senusi became the closest disciple of Ahmad ibn Idris al-Farsi, the Moroccan teacher whose Tariqa Muhammadiyya had been quietly reshaping the Sufi life of the Hijaz. In 1837, the year of his teacher's death, al-Senusi founded his own first lodge, the first zawiya of what would be called the Sanusiya, at Mount Abu Qubays, the hill overlooking the Kaaba itself. He acquired the title that would attach to him for the rest of his life, and after, al-Sanusi al-Kabir, the Grand Senusi. But Mecca proved hostile ground. His Sufi reformism collided with the conservative Hashemite ulema of the Holy City, and around 1840 he set out, intending to return home to Algeria. By then, however, the French Marshal Bugeaud was burning his way through the western Maghreb, and home no longer existed. He turned eastward instead into the one stretch of the Mediterranean coast where neither European armies nor effective Ottoman administration reached. In 1843, in the green highlands of the Jebel Akhdar in eastern Cyrenaica, near the ruins of the ancient Greek city of Cyrene, the Grand Senusi established the headquarters of his order. The new mother lodge was called Al-Zawiya al-Baida, the White Lodge, and it functioned as something the modern world has no single word for. It was simultaneously a mosque, a religious school, a court of arbitration where blood feuds between Bedouin tribes could be settled without dishonour, a hostel for travellers, an agricultural estate cultivated by the brothers of the order themselves, a trading post on the caravan routes, and a refugee for anyone the Ottoman authorities or the European consuls were looking for. The local tribes, the Awakir, the Bara'asa, the Abid, the Harabi Confederation, provided protection and labour. The Sultan of Wadai, far to the south, sent gifts and promised protection on the desert routes. The order grew quickly because it filled a vacuum that nothing else could fill. It offered religious legitimacy to tribal chiefs, mediation to feuding clans, education to the children of the Bedouin, and security to the merchants of the caravan trade. By the mid-1850s, Ottoman observers in Benghazi were sending nervous reports to Istanbul about a religious power they could not control. In 1856, the Grand Senusi moved his headquarters about 280 kilometres southeast, deep into the desert, to the oasis of Jagbub, near the present-day Egyptian frontier. There he constructed an Islamic university with a library of 8,000 volumes, a palace, a mosque, and an agricultural complex sustained by oasis water. From Jagbub he trained the missionary cadre, the Ikhwan, the brothers who would carry the order outward across the Sahara. He was a man of austere personal habits. He forbade his followers tobacco and coffee. He required the brothers to earn their living through manual labour rather than depend on alms. He died at Jagbub on the 7th of September 1859. By then, his order operated 52 zawiyas across North Africa. Leadership passed to his 15-year-old son, Muhammad al-Mahdi al-Senusi, who had been born at al-Baida in 1844. For the first several years of al-Mahdi's nominal headship, the order was administered by a council of his father's chief disciples in what was effectively a regency. By the mid-1860s, al-Mahdi had taken full personal control, and he proved to be the great expander of the family enterprise. By the time of his death in 1902, the network had grown from his father's 52 zawiyas to 146 lodges, including 30 in Egypt, 17 in the Hijaz, 14 in Sudan, with extensions reaching as far as Fez in the west, Damascus and Istanbul in the north, and the trading cities of West Africa to the south. The Order's student body has been estimated at around 15,000. To understand how this network actually functioned as something resembling a state, we have to look at what happened inside an individual zawiya. A typical Senusi lodge in the late 19th century was led by a sheikh who had been personally appointed by the head of the order and supported by an administrative deputy and a varying number of resident brothers. The lodge collected the religious tax called zakat from the surrounding tribes. It mediated disputes that would otherwise have been settled by blood feud, and the parties involved accepted its judgments because the sheikh's Sharifian descent placed him outside the segmentary balance of the tribal system, meaning he could rule against either party without triggering vendetta. It taught the children of the local population the Quran, the basics of Maliki jurisprudence, and the principles of Sufi devotion. It cultivated date palms and grain. It maintained warehouses for caravan goods. It collected tolls from passing merchants in exchange for guides and protection. It coordinated with neighbouring lodges across distances. No formal state administered. The result was a continuous network of religious authority, economic infrastructure, and informal governance that stretched across a region the size of India, all of it answerable to a single family living first at Jagbub and later at Kufra. Annual revenues ran into millions of francs by the 1890s. Al-Mahdi maintained a careful and pragmatic relationship with the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who in 1886 dispatched the Damascene envoy Sadiq el-Muayyad to Jagbub, and again in 1895 to Kufra, in recognition that the order's de facto authority in Cyrenaica now exceeded that of the Sultan's own appointed governor. He was equally careful with the rival millennial movement that had erupted to his south. In 1881, in the Sudan, a religious leader named Muhammad Ahmad declared himself the eschatological Mahdi, the prophesied figure who would appear at the end of time to restore justice. The Sudanese Mahdi twice wrote to al-Mahdi al-Senusi, inviting him to be one of his 4 caliphs. Al-Senusi gave no reply. Despite sharing the title, he never claimed the eschatological role, and he allied with the Sultan of Wadai to block the advance of Mahdist forces from Darfur in 1890. The Senusi were content to be what they were, a Sufi order that happened to administer a desert empire. They had no interest in becoming an apocalyptic state. In 1895, al-Mahdi moved the order's headquarters again, this time about 625 kilometers southeast of Jagbub, to the oasis archipelago of Kufra, deep in the Libyan Sahara. The move reflected 2 pressures. The Ottoman Pasha of Benghazi had visited Jagbub in 1889 accompanied by troops, a clear signal that Istanbul's tolerance was thinning, and French colonial expansion northward from the Congo Basin was beginning to threaten the southern arc of the order's caravan empire. From Kufra, al-Mahdi extended new lodges deep into Chad and the Lake Chad Basin. In 1899, he himself moved south to the Senusi outpost at Guru in northern Chad to direct the resistance to French advance personally. The first major engagement at Bir al-Ali in November of 1901 was a Senusi victory, with the French commander Captain Millos killed. The second, in January of 1902, was a French victory in which the lodge was burned. Al-Mahdi died at Guru on the 2nd of June 1902. He had been head of the order for 43 years. Because Al-Mahdi's eldest son, Muhammad Idris, was only 12 years old, leadership passed instead to a nephew, Ahmad al-Sharif al-Senusi, who had been born at Jaghbub in 1873. Ahmad al-Sharif inherited a network at the height of its territorial reach, but on the brink of catastrophe. By 1909, the French had taken the Wadai capital of Abeche, and by 1913 they had occupied the Borku-Enedi-Tibesti region of northern Chad. The Wadai to Benghazi trade artery, the economic backbone of the order for nearly a century, was cut. Within 2 years, an even greater catastrophe arrived from the north. On the 29th of September 1911, the Kingdom of Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire with the explicit aim of seizing the Libyan provinces. Italian troops landed at Tripoli, Tobruk, Derna and Benghazi within days. The Byzantine Italo-Turkish War would last just over a year, and it carried world historical consequences far beyond the immediate fighting. On the 1st of November 1911, an Italian pilot named Giulio Gavotti dropped 4 small grenades from his Ettrick Taube monoplane onto Ottoman positions at the Ain Zara oasis south of Tripoli, the first offensive use of aircraft for bombing in the history of warfare, prefiguring the entire age of aerial bombardment that would shape the 20th century. Among the Ottoman officers who arrived to assist the resistance was a young staff officer named Mustafa Kemal, the future founder of modern Turkey, who would later be known to the world as Ataturk. He served alongside Enver Pasha, who would become the Ottoman Empire's effective wartime ruler, and Fethi Bey, who would become independent Turkey's first prime minister. The Italo-Turkish War, which most general audiences have never heard of, was the training ground of the men who would dismantle the Ottoman Empire and build its successor states. For the Senussi, the war meant the beginning of a 40-year struggle against Italian occupation. When the Ottoman Caliph called for jihad against the Allied powers on the 14th of November 1914, Ahmad al-Sharif answered. Ottoman military advisors infiltrated into Cyrenaica by submarine. Most importantly, Nuri Bey, half-brother of Enver Pasha, and an Iraqi Arab officer named Jafar al-Askari. German support arrived by sea in the form of U-boat operations along the North African coast. On the 5th of November 1915, the German submarine U-35 sank the British armed yacht HMS Tara in the Bay of Sollum and handed over more than 90 surviving crew to the Senussi as prisoners. What followed was an episode of the First World War that almost no general audience has heard of, but which had quietly enormous strategic consequences. Between November of 1915 and February of 1917, Senussi forces of around 5,000 trained regulars supported by tribal irregulars crossed into British-occupied Egypt and forced the British to form an entirely new military command, the Western Frontier Force, eventually involving around 30,000 imperial troops drawn from South Africa, New Zealand, India, Australia, and the British Yeomanry. Those were 30,000 soldiers who could not be sent to Gallipoli, where the catastrophic evacuation was unfolding through the winter of 1915, and who could not be sent to Mesopotamia, where the British force at Kut surrendered to the Ottomans on the 29th of April 1916. On the 17th of March 1916, a British rescue column led personally by the 2nd Duke of Westminster, commanding around 45 Rolls-Royce armoured cars, drove 120 miles into uncharted Cyrenaica in 22 hours and rescued 92 surviving HMS Tara prisoners who had been reduced, in the words of one of their officers, to living skeletons. Westminster received the Distinguished Service Order. More importantly, the mobile armoured car tactics he pioneered against the Senusi would be studied by Field Marshal Wavell and adapted directly by T.E. Lawrence and the Hejaz armoured car section in the Arab Revolt of 1916 and 1917. And at the action of Agagia on the 26th of February 1916, the Iraqi Senussi commander Jafar al-Askari was captured, wounded by the Dorset Yeomanry. He would later defect, join Faisal's Arab Revolt, and become the first Prime Minister of independent Iraq. A campaign against a Sufi religious order in the western desert of Egypt thus indirectly seeded the Hashemite state in Baghdad. Defeat in Egypt fatally undermined Ahmad al-Sharif's authority. In 1916, he ceded effective leadership of the order to his 26-year-old cousin, Muhammad Idris, the son of al-Mahdi, who had been too young to inherit in 1902. 2 years later, Ahmad al-Sharif was extracted from the Gulf of Sirte by a German submarine on the orders of Enver Pasha, taken to Pola and thence to Istanbul, and lived out the remainder of his life in exile in Damascus and Medina, where he died on the 10th of March 1933. His successor, Muhammad Idris ibn Muhammad al-Mahdi al-Senusi, born at Jaghbub on the 12th of March 1889, was a man of an entirely different temperament from his cousin. Quiet, devout, prone to ill health, more comfortable in a desert lodge than on a battlefield or at a conference table, Idris would prove to be the family's great political survivor. The British, exhausted by the Senussi War in Egypt, were eager to come to terms with him. In April of 1917, the modus vivendi of al-Akrama, signed at Akroma, west of Tobruk, ended Senussi attacks on the British. 3 years later, on the 25th of October 1920, the Italian colonial government in Rome went a step further. By the Treaty of Al-Rajma, Italy recognized Idris as the Emir of Cyrenaica, Amir Barka, granting him autonomous administration over Kufra, Jagbub, Jalu, Aujila, and Ajdabia, and a monthly subsidy of 62,000 lire. For 2 years, the Senusi held a recognized princely state. In January of 1922, the leaders of the short-lived Tripolitanian Republic, formally proclaimed at Misrata on the 16th of November 1918, and considered by historians to be the first formal Arab republic of the modern era, formally offered Idris the title of Emir of all Libya. Idris accepted in November of that year. But 10 days before he formally took the title, on the 28th of October 1922, Benito Mussolini and his fascists marched on Rome, and within a week Mussolini was Italy's Prime Minister. The new fascist government regarded the Pan-Libyan Emirate as a casus belli. In December of 1922, Idris fled into exile in Egypt. He would not return permanently to Libya for 25 years. What followed in his absence was the most violent episode in the modern history of North Africa, and it deserves to be told with care because it has been minimized in European memory ever since. The Italian Pacification of Libya, formally launched in 1923 under Marshal Pietro Badoglio, and from 1930 under his vice-governor of Cyrenaica, General Rodolfo Graziani, employed methods that would become benchmarks of 20th century state violence. The face of the resistance was a 73-year-old Senussi sheikh named Sidi Umar al-Mukhtar, Muhammad bin Farhat al-Manifi, the man European audiences know, if they know him at all, from the 1981 Anthony Quinn film, Lion of the Desert. Mukhtar had been born in 1858 at Zawiyat Janzur, east of Tobruk, had studied for 8 years at the Senussi University of Jagbub under al-Mahdi himself, and had fought the French in Chad alongside the order in the early 1900s. From 1911 onward, well into his 60s and 70s, he led mobile flying columns through the Jebel Akhdar in a guerrilla campaign that pinned down increasingly large Italian forces. In April of 1931, Graziani built the structure that broke the resistance. Stretching 271 kilometers south from El Ramle on the Gulf of Sollum to Jagbub, 4 parallel lines of barbed wire mounted on iron stakes 9 meters wide cut Mukhtar's fighters off from their resupply across the Egyptian frontier. The line was patrolled by armoured cars and aircraft. 3 large forts, Capuzzo, Maddalena, and Giarabub, anchored its length. Behind the wire, Graziani forcibly relocated almost the entire civilian population of the Cyrenaican Bedouin into a network of 16 concentration camps along the Mediterranean coast, including the camps at El Agheila, Soluch, Massa Brega, and Driana. The camps held at their peak around 100,000 people. The civilian population of Cyrenaica fell, according to Italian census figures, from 225,000 in 1929 to 142,000 in 1934. A deficit of 83,000 human beings. The Libyan-American historian Ali Abdulatif Ahmida, whose 2020 book on the subject argues for a genocide framing, estimates the death toll in the camps and from associated military operations at 60,000 to 70,000. Italian aircraft dropped mustard gas on tribal columns in violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Livestock losses ran to more than 500,000 animals, destroying the Bedouin pastoral economy permanently. Mukhtar was wounded and captured at the Wadi Boutaka near Slonta on the 11th of September 1931. After a one-day military trial, he was hanged at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 16th of September 1931 at the Soluch concentration camp before an estimated 20,000 forcibly assembled Bedouin internees. He was 73 years old. On the 24th of January 1932, Marshal Badoglio formally proclaimed the pacification of Cyrenaica complete. The Italian camps in Cyrenaica predated the Nazi camp at Dachau by more than a year, and they served directly as the operational template for the Italian camps in Ethiopia after the 1935 invasion. The Anthony Quinn film about Omar Mukhtar, released in 1981 and funded with $35 million from a Libyan ruler whose own relationship with the Senusi we will come to shortly, was banned in Italy by the Andreotti government in 1982 as damaging to the honour of the Italian army. It was not aired on Italian television until the 11th of June 2009. For Idris in his Egyptian exile, the news from Cyrenaica must have been a slow form of agony. The Senusi network he had inherited had been physically destroyed. Most of his family's zawiyas were rubble. Most of his order's tribal base was either dead in camps or scattered in refugee communities along the Egyptian border. By 1934, when Italy formally unified the 3 Libyan provinces into a single colony called Italian Libya, it appeared that the Senussi had been erased. In 1931, in the oasis of Siwa, Idris had married his cousin Fatima el-Sharif, daughter of his old rival Ahmad al-Sharif. Their only biological child, a son, would be born in 1953 and live for 1 day. They would later adopt an Algerian orphan named Suleima. Their childless marriage would have political consequences neither of them could yet anticipate. Then came the war that gave the Senussi back their country. Italy declared war on the Allied powers on the 10th of June, 1940. On the 7th, 8th, and 9th of August 1940, Idris convened a conference of about 25 Cyrenaican tribal leaders in Cairo. On the 9th of August they announced the formation of the Sanusi army, soon renamed the Libyan Arab Force, eventually composed of 5 infantry battalions trained at the Imbaba camp outside Cairo and fighting under the black banner with the white crescent and star that was the symbol of the Senusi order. Estimates of total enrolment over the war years range from 5,000 to 14,000 men. 3 Libyan Arab Force battalions served in the garrison during the long siege of Tobruk in 1941. Senussi guides were attached to almost every long-range British operation in the Western Desert. The Long Range Desert Group, founded in July of 1940 by Major Ralph Bagnold, conducted operations continuously behind enemy lines from December of 1940 until April of 1943, missing only 15 days, and its central operational asset was the geographical knowledge of Senussi guides, most famously a tribal leader named Sheikh Abd el-Galil Saif el-Nasser, whose understanding of water sources, sand seas and passable terrain was simply not present in any European cartography. The long-range desert group's road watch on the Tripoli to Benghazi coastal road provided Montgomery with the intelligence on Rommel's strength and supply situation that made the El Alamein victory possible. Without Senussi cooperation, the Allied victory in North Africa would have looked materially different. On the 8th of January 1942, the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden stood up in the House of Commons and publicly thanked, by name, Said Idris el-Senussi, a public commitment that, in the way British politics works, would prove difficult to walk back later. When the war ended, the question of what to do with Libya became one of the first serious tests of the new United Nations system. The European powers initially proposed the Bevin-Sforza plan, drafted by the British and Italian foreign ministers, which would have created a 10-year UN trusteeship dividing the country between Italian, British and French administration. The plan was rejected by the General Assembly on the 18th of May 1949 by a vote of 37 against to 14 in favour with 7 abstentions, in part because of massive anti-Italian rioting in Tripoli during the debate. The Italian portion of the plan failed by a single vote, the decisive ballot cast by the Haitian Senator Émile Saint-Lô against the return of any colonial power to North African soil. 6 months later, on the 21st of November 1949, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 289 by 48 votes in favour, 1 against Ethiopia, and 9 abstentions. The resolution declared that Libya, comprising Cyrenaica, Tripolitania and Fezzan, would become an independent and sovereign state by the 1st of January 1952. It was the first time in history that the United Nations itself had created a sovereign state. The model would later inform the international handling of Namibia, Eritrea, East Timor and South Sudan. Adrian Pelt, the Dutch UN commissioner appointed on the 10th of December 1949, spent the next 2 years working with the National Constituent Assembly, 60 members, 20 from each province, to draft the constitution that was adopted on the 7th of October 1951. It established a federal constitutional monarchy with a bicameral legislature, with Tripoli and Benghazi serving as alternating capitals, and Idris's preferred residence at the small mountain town of Beda. On the 24th of December 1951 came the moment from the Manor Palace balcony with which this story began. The young United Kingdom of Libya was, at independence, one of the poorest countries in the world. Population was around 1 million. Per capita annual income was around 25 to 35 United States dollars. Adult literacy was below 15%. The economy depended almost entirely on foreign aid and on rent from foreign military bases. The Anglo-Libyan Treaty of Friendship and Alliance, signed in Benghazi on the 29th of July 1953, gave Britain the use of bases including RAF El Adam near Tobruk in exchange for £2.75 million annually, plus £1 million in development aid. The United States Agreement of the 9th of September 1954 gave the United States Air Force the use of Wheelers Field east of Tripoli At its peak in 1958, an aircraft was taking off from Wheelus every 45 seconds in exchange for around $4 million a year. France withdrew from Fezzan by the end of 1956, in part because of the Suez Crisis. Libya joined the Arab League in March of 1953 and the United Nations in December of 1955. On paper, this was a small, poor, dependent state. Then everything changed. In April of 1955, the Libyan parliament passed the Petroleum Law, which divided the country into many small concession blocks rather than handing exclusive rights to a single company. The deliberate fragmentation, which the historian Dirk van der Wal has identified as one of the few moments when Libyan national interest overrode provincial bargaining, opened concessions to around 40 international firms across some 600,000 square kilometres of territory. The first Libyan oil flowed in January of 1958 from the Atchan well drilled by Esso Standard. The breakthrough came in June of 1959, when Esso completed the discovery well at the Zelton field in the Sirte Basin at 17,500 barrels per day, with proven reserves estimated at 2.5 billion barrels. On the 25th of October 1961, the first oil tanker loaded at the Marsa Brega terminal, at the end of a 175-kilometre pipeline from Zelton, bound for the United Kingdom. The transformation that followed was breathtaking. By 1965, Libya was the sixth largest oil-producing country in the world. By 1967, it was supplying one-third of all Western European oil imports and was the world's fourth largest producer. Pre-coup peak production reached around 3.3 million barrels per day. GDP per capita climbed from the $25 to $35 range at independence to roughly $2,000 by 1969, a 50 to 80-fold nominal increase in less than 2 decades, equivalent in real terms to perhaps 15 to 17,000 of today's dollars. The University of Libya was founded at Benghazi in December of 1955. In 1963, the federal system was abolished and the country was simply renamed the Kingdom of Libya. In 1964, Libyan women voted in parliamentary elections for the first time, ahead of Switzerland, which would not extend the federal franchise to women until 1971, and ahead of Portugal, which would not do so until 1976. At the centre of all this stood King Idris, by now in his late 70s, increasingly frail, increasingly absent. He refused to put his image on Libyan currency. The only public building in the country named after him was Tripoli's Idris Airport. He preferred his quiet palace at Beda to the bustle of the capital. He banned political parties. He was, in van der Wal's careful phrase, self-effacing and reluctant to engage in politics. For the most part, the day-to-day work of government was done by a court entourage built around an advisor named Ibrahim al-Shelhi, who had been assassinated in 1954 by a relative of the Queen and around al-Shelhi's sons. To the urban, increasingly literate, increasingly politicized young population in Tripoli and Benghazi, saturated with Cairo radio broadcasting Gamal Abdel Nasser's pan-Arab message, then radicalized by Israel's victory in the Six-Day War of June 1967 and the subsequent anti-Western and anti-Jewish riots that drove Libya's last Jewish community out of the country. The king seemed less the founder of the nation than a relic of its colonial past. By the summer of 1969, the king himself had reached the same conclusion. On the 4th of August 1969, the 79-year-old Idris signed an instrument of abdication, scheduled to take effect on the 2nd of September in favour of his designated successor, his nephew Crown Prince Hassan as-Senussi. He was 28 days too late. On the morning of the 1st of September 1969, while King Idris and Queen Fatima were at a clinic in Bursa, Turkey for medical treatment, approximately 70 junior officers of the Libyan Armed Forces, calling themselves the Free Officers Movement, and led by a 27-year-old captain named Muammar Muhammad Abu Minyar al-Gaddafi from the small Qaddafi tribe near Sirte, launched what they called Operation Jerusalem. The entire bloodless seizure of the country was complete in approximately 2 hours. Captain Gaddafi went on the radio at 6:30 in the morning to broadcast Communique Number 1, abolishing the monarchy and proclaiming the Libyan Arab Republic under a revolutionary command council. Crown Prince Hassan, the man who had been due to become King Hassan I in 28 days' time, was placed under house arrest, brought to a television studio at gunpoint, and forced to read out a renunciation of the throne and a pledge of allegiance to the new regime. If you have watched our video on the Habsburg children who survived the empire's collapse, you will recognize the shape of what was beginning to happen to the Senusi family. Otto von Habsburg, 8 years old, looking out of a train window as it carried him away from Schönbrunn Palace in November of 1918, would spend the next 90 years of his life as the symbolic remainder of an empire that had been deleted around him, eventually closing the arc by signing the Lisbon Treaty in 2008 as a member of the European Parliament. The Senussi family's children were about to inherit a similar burden, to live the rest of their lives as the surviving names of a kingdom that had been switched off. The crucial difference was that nothing in Otto's exile, comfortable in Bavaria and respected across Europe, prepared anyone for what would happen to the Senussi family next. What followed in Libya over the next 42 years is, even by the standards of 20th century dictatorships, an unusually thorough and unusually personal exercise in dynastic erasure. The Gaddafi regime did not merely depose the Senussi, it set out to delete them from the country's memory. The Senusi tricolour with its crescent and star, which had flown over Libya since 1951, was lowered on the morning of the 1st of September, 1969. It was replaced by the red, white and black Arab Liberation flag. In January of 1972, that flag was replaced by the standard of the Federation of Arab Republics. On the 11th of November, 1977, after Anwar Sadat's visit to Jerusalem, Gaddafi changed the Libyan flag yet again, this time to a plain green field with no symbol or device of any kind. The only single-colour national flag in the world. It would fly over Libya for 34 years. Streets, schools, hospitals, mosques and airports bearing Senusi names were renamed, typically after revolutionary themes. The 1st of September, the Al-Fateh Revolution, Arab Unity, Palestine, or after dead Gaddafi loyalists. Tripoli's Idris Airport became Tripoli International. Wheelus Air Base, after the United States completed its withdrawal on the 11th of June, 1970, was renamed Okba Ben Nafi after a 7th century Arab conqueror. The royal palaces were converted to government and university buildings. The Manor Palace itself, where Idris had stood on the balcony in 1951, became part of the University of Benghazi. Royal archives were either destroyed or removed to military intelligence. School textbooks were rewritten to minimize or vilify the Senusi era. The 42 years from 1927 to 1969 became, in the official narrative of Gaddafi's Jamahiriya, an interval of foreign-imposed monarchy that the people had finally cast off. The persecution of the family itself was severe and personal. Crown Prince Hassan was held in formal imprisonment for around 2 years and then in strict house arrest for the rest of the 1970s and 1980s. In 1982, revolutionary committees acting on Gaddafi's orders destroyed his Tripoli home and his possessions and forced his family to live in a shack on the city's beach. In 1987, he suffered a serious stroke. Only in 1988, in poor health, was he permitted to travel to London for medical treatment. He died there on the 28th of April, 1992, aged 63. His remains were eventually buried beside King Idris at the Jannat al-Baqi Cemetery in Medina. King Idris himself had died in his Cairo exile on the 25th of May, 1983, at the age of 94. Queen Fatima outlived almost everyone, dying in Cairo on the 3rd of October, 2009, at the age of 98. Another member of the family, Ahmed al-Zubair al-Senusi, who had attempted to overthrow Gaddafi in 1970 and been sentenced to death, served 31 years in Libyan prisons before his release in 2001, 4 years longer than Nelson Mandela, making him at the time the world's longest-serving political prisoner. In October of 2011, the European Parliament awarded him the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought. The destruction of the order's spiritual infrastructure was equally systematic. In 1984, on Gaddafi's direct orders, the mother Zawiya at Jagbub, the desert university built by the Grand Senussi himself in the 1850s, was destroyed. The 120-year-old tomb of the founder, Sayyid Muhammad ibn Ali al-Senussi al-Khattabi al-Hassani al-Idrisi, was blown apart. His remains were exhumed and scattered in the desert. Across Libya, dozens of Senussi-affiliated zawiyas were demolished or repurposed. There is a particular sociological note worth recording about the man who ordered all of this. Muammar Gaddafi was born around 1942 into the Qadadfa, a small client tribe of the Marabtin category, who in the traditional Cyrenaican social order had been historically subordinate to the same noble Saadi tribes, the Awakir, the Bara'asa, the Magharba, that had constituted the Senussi heartland. The 42-year campaign of dynastic erasure was, among other things, a particularly thorough inversion of an old hierarchy. And then, on the 17th of February, 2011, what the protesters called the Day of Rage, deliberately chosen as the anniversary of Gaddafi's 1987 hanging of 6 dissidents and his 2006 killing of 11 protesters. Something quietly remarkable began to happen in the streets of Benghazi. Protesters carried, and within days began to fly from rooftops and from rebel-held buildings, the red, black and green tricolour with a white crescent and star. The flag of the Kingdom of Libya, the flag of the Senussi, banned for 42 years. The National Transitional Council, formed in Benghazi on the 27th of February under Chairman Mustafa Abdul Jalil, adopted it as its official banner. Rebel brigades took names like the Omar Mukhtar Brigade. When NATO's Operation Unified Protector ended on the 31st of October 2011, 11 days after Gaddafi's capture and death near Sirte, and Libya emerged as a transitional state, the Senussi tricolour returned officially as the national flag of Libya. It flies over the country today. On the 5th of March 2014, the Libyan transitional government formally rehabilitated the Senussi family, reversing the in absentia death sentence that had been passed against King Idris in 1971. The current head of the Senussi house is Sayyid Mohammed bin Hassan al-Rida al-Mahdi as-Senussi, born in Tripoli on the 20th of October 1962, the second son of Crown Prince Hassan and his wife Fawzia bint Tahir el-Bakir. He was 6 years old at the time of the coup. He was 26 when his father took him into permanent exile in London in 1988. 6 weeks after his father's death in April of 1992, Hassan's last will was read at a press conference in London, designating Mohammed as head of the royal house and crown prince. He has lived in the United Kingdom ever since, unmarried, conducting an unhurried public diplomacy from his London office. He has consistently advocated for a constitutional monarchy modelled on Spain or the United Kingdom, anchored in the 1951 Constitution, which on his account was never formally annulled, only ignored. He has used his platform, including an address to the European Parliament on the 20th of April 2011 and a televised statement on the 73rd anniversary of Libyan independence on the 24th of December 2024, to argue for a return to constitutional legitimacy as a path out of the country's continuing fragmentation. We covered a comparable case in our video on Italy's last royal family, the 55-year exile of Vittorio Emanuele of Savoy, under the 13th article of the Italian Constitution, which specifically banned male descendants of the House of Savoy from setting foot on Italian soil, and his March 2003 return to kiss the tarmac at Fiumicino, followed within 3 years by his arrest on corruption charges. The Senussi case is in some ways the inverse pattern. The family's removal from Libya was extra-constitutional, the act of a coup, not a clause. And the family's potential return is itself constitutional, anchored in a document that has technical legal continuity. Whether that legal continuity ever translates into political reality remains the open question of post-2011 Libya. What remains in the end is the building, the flag, and the family. The Al-Baida Lodge in the Jebel Akhdar still stands. The Manor Palace in Benghazi still stands, now part of the University of Benghazi. The flag designed by Omar Fayek Shenib in 1951 flies over Libyan embassies around the world. The grandson of the man on the balcony in 1951 lives in West London and does interviews with Al Jazeera, a brotherhood that began with a single Algerian theologian climbing a hill above Mecca in 1837 became, within 3 generations, the only Sufi religious order in modern history to produce an internationally recognized king, and the family's continued existence into the present day represents one of the longest continuous claims to a deleted throne anywhere in the modern Islamic world. What do you think of the Senussi? Were they Libya's authentic founding dynasty? A religious order that built the country's first state from the ground up, that paid in blood at the Italian camps, that earned its throne through a United Nations process, which has never since been repeated, and was therefore robbed of its inheritance by a coup that no constitution authorized? Or were they an aging, foreign-aligned monarchy whose Cold War posture and absentee king made the 1969 revolution the inevitable correction of a state that had been imposed on Libya rather than chosen by it? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.